Welcome to part 1 of my 8-part series on science in the Bible. I strongly suggest that you listen to the parts in sequence. Enjoy. Good evening, folks. Thank you for coming. You are in the right place. For the next 4 Monday nights, we are going to be discussing science in the Bible and taking a fresh look at the debate on origins. Now let's talk about what we're going to be doing tonight. Let me give you an overview of the entire course, and then I'm going to give you an outline that'll break it down into weeks, just so you know where we're going. Okay? We're going to be looking at the foundations of science and the scientific method. We're going to be studying facts, theories, and physical laws. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about origins and processes. We're going to consider the debate on origins with regard to the universe. Where did everything come from? The debate on origins with regard to life, and this of course involves the Darwinian theory. We're going to talk about geology, which is the science of the earth itself, and paleontology, which has to do with fossils, and the question of how old is the earth and how old is the universe. And by the way, I'll give you a little sneak preview. One of the interesting things that we're going to see is there is now scientific evidence to support the possibility that the earth and the universe may not be the same age. And it's not because the earth was created late in the history of the universe. There's actually a possibility that the earth and the universe as a whole were created in the same event, and yet they're not the same age. And that has to do with some very strange things involved in how time passes. We're going to talk briefly about Christians in secular academia. And we're going to have some conclusions and strategies. Okay, that's the basic material that we're going to cover. Now here's a course outline, and this, I believe, is in your handout. It tells you what we'll be doing each week. Now you can see that tonight we're going to be looking at the nature of the battle. There is a battle going on. There's a debate going on regarding origins. We're going to be talking about the biblical foundations of science, and one of the things that we'll see as we discuss that is that it's actually the biblical worldview that made it possible for modern science to come into existence. And then we're going to talk about facts, theories, and the scientific method. Okay? So that's where we're headed tonight. Now, I want to make an appeal to you. You now have the course outline. You know what we're going to be doing each week. Please do not look and say, this week is interesting to me and that week isn't, and come only for the week that sounds interesting. Now the reason I say that is that this course is designed to be cumulative. Each week builds on the previous weeks, and if you, for example, choose not to come next week, but you do come for the third week when we talk about Darwinianism, you're going to miss a lot. You need the foundation of week 2 to understand week 3, etc. Okay? So please come to all 4 sessions. And by the way, if you want to get credit in the general certificate program for attending the course, you have to attend all 4 sessions. Okay? All right, now let me tell you a little bit about myself. Okay? You may be wondering who this guy is up front who's talking, what I'm doing in Hong Kong, why I have a right to talk about science and the Bible. I was a scientist before I became a Christian. Okay, I was raised in a Unitarian home. Now, most of you don't know what Unitarians are, but my father was a Unitarian minister. The Unitarians call themselves a church, but the overwhelming majority of Unitarians are atheists, and the few who aren't atheists are most definitely not Christians. I was taught when I was growing up that the Bible was a book full of myths, that it was completely unreliable. My father was an atheist. He taught me to be an atheist. I was actually a very committed atheist. I used to love to argue with the Christian kids in the school where I went, and I was very good at arguing. I could make them look foolish. Now that wasn't because I was right, it's just because I was good at arguing. Okay? Now, I studied physics in my undergraduate studies. I also studied philosophy. I majored in physics and minored in philosophy. And around the middle of my second year studying physics, I came to a conclusion that really bothered me. You see, I was a committed atheist, and in order to be an atheist, I needed what every atheist needs. Every atheist needs an explanation for where life comes from. Because if there is no God, life must come from something other than God. In the process of studying physics, we studied the laws of thermodynamics, which we will talk about next week. And basically, the laws of thermodynamics said you can't get something from nothing. You can't get order from disorder. You can't get knowledge from nonsense. And as I thought about that, I applied it to my understanding of the theory of Darwinian evolution. And I could not escape the conclusion that Darwinism was bad science. Now, we won't be talking about Darwinism until our third session together. But I believe by the time we get there, you will begin to see why Darwinism cannot be true. And it's a little, I wouldn't call it a dirty secret, but it's a secret in the academic world that many scientists who are not Christians, scientists who approach science just as all other scientists approach it, as a purely physical thing, many of them have come to the conclusion that life is so incredibly complex, it cannot be the result of a series of accidents. By the way, that's what Darwinism says. And many of those scientists have had the courage to advance the idea that life appears to have an intelligent designer. Now, without talking about God, and just going that far has cost many of them their jobs. It's cost them their reputations. They have been kicked out of universities, they have lost their funding, they have been slandered. Terrible things have been done to these men and women because they had the courage to follow the evidence where it leads and to say, you know, it really looks like this was designed. Okay. Well, those kinds of ideas were coming to me during my college years. And so in order to keep my intellectual integrity, I had to move from being an atheist. An atheist is a person who's committed to the idea that there is no God, to being an agnostic. Now, an agnostic is simply a person who says, I don't know whether there's a God or not. Right? Now, I did not want to admit the existence of God, because in order to admit the existence of God, I would have to face the fact that I have a creator, and I would have to face the fact that because he is my creator, he has the right to tell me how to live. So I was stuck in this unpleasant sort of limbo place between atheism and theism for many years. It wasn't until I was 26, almost 27, that I came to faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. Now, by the time that I was 26, I had been working in physics research in various areas. I worked for Bell Laboratories, if any of you know who Bell Laboratories was. I worked for Bell Laboratories for 2 years. I went to Cornell University, got my master's degree. I worked in geophysical research there. I'd been working in research for about 6, almost 7 years. I got saved, and I didn't stop being a scientist. I kept working in physics. I worked for another 4 years at the Cornell Lab of Nuclear Studies. We were running a positron electron collider, kind of a small-scale version of that big monster machine over in Europe called CERN. And I had no difficulty being a Christian and being a scientist. In fact, one of the interesting things is that Christian scientists have a benefit and a blessing that scientists who refuse to recognize the existence of God do not have. They have the benefit of being able to say, not only, wow, I discovered something, but wow, I discovered something, and this means God made it, and I can admire God at the same time as I admire this thing that I've discovered. Right? So science from a theistic perspective, science where you recognize the existence of God, is actually a good thing. It's a blessing. Okay? And I think we have some Christian scientists in this room who know what I'm talking about. Okay? So anyway, to sort of summarize my situation, I'm a former atheist. I was converted. I became a follower of Jesus Christ at the age of 26. I have a master's degree in physics from Cornell University. I have a master's of theology and a doctor of philosophy from Dallas Theological Seminary. I worked for 10 years in physics research. And this sort of gives me a unique perspective. There aren't too many people in theological education who come from this kind of background. And I'm very grateful to have that background. You know, the Lord arranges things for His purposes, and I think He did that to prepare me to teach this class, among other things. Now, as we move forward into this course, let me say something about our approach and our assumptions. We are going to approach this topic from a Christian worldview, but we're going to lay the foundation for the Christian worldview. We're going to approach this topic with confidence in the reliability of the Bible. Now, I know that there may be some of you here who are not Christians and who don't have confidence in the reliability of the Bible, and that's okay. That's okay. Let me simply say this. In most discussions of science in the world today, those who discuss science are hostile to the Bible. They're hostile to Christianity. So maybe we're getting a little bit of balance time here. Okay? And if you're not a Christian and if you don't trust the Bible, just take this as an opportunity to see what the other side thinks. All right? Now, I think it's very important that as we talk about this topic, we keep in mind charity and respect. Okay? It's important to respect people with differing viewpoints. You can disagree and still respect those who have other viewpoints. And again, I'm very happy if you're a non-Christian and you're here. Okay, I hope this will give you an opportunity to see how Christians approach this topic. Okay? So let's talk about the nature of the battle in the debate on origins. Who is fighting? What are they fighting about, and why? Okay. Well, there are basically three issues we're fighting about. The truth regarding three fundamental questions. The first question is the origin of the universe as a whole. Where did everything come from? You know, if you have children, as your children begin to grow up, they always ask these questions. Where did everything come from? Who made the sun? Those kinds of things. I remember one of the toughest questions that my youngest son asked me. He said, "Why can't I grow a tail?" That was a tough one to answer. Okay? We're going to be talking about the origin of life. Where does life come from? You know, we see these wonderful television programs on TV. A lot of them, the nature programs, are narrated by this guy named David Attenborough. He seemed to narrate all of them, you know, and he's a very good narrator, but I have to tell you, I'm always annoyed when I hear his voice because he always will say something like this: evolution developed this thing. And my head is saying, no, it didn't. Right? We're also going to be talking about the nature of reality. Now, this is maybe an even more fundamental question than these two, but they all go together. Okay? So, regarding these three questions, here they are: the origin of the universe, the origin of life, and the nature of reality. We're going to be looking at the views offered by establishment science and the views offered by those who hold Scripture in high regard. Now, when I say establishment science, I am talking about this vast system that's publicly funded and privately funded, that controls most universities, most public research facilities, most private research facilities. It's a large system. Now, establishment science typically argues that the universe came into existence in an event called the Big Bang. Now, there's a new version of it called the Big Crunch, We'll be talking about that. They will typically say that life came into existence through an accidental, impersonal process known as Neo-Darwinism. And this is very important. Establishment science will typically say that reality is purely and only physical. In other words, everything that exists can be explained in terms of matter in motion. And there are 4 dimensions. Right? If you remember your Cartesian coordinates from high school, x, y, and z, up, down, right, left, in, out. And the 4th dimension is what?
Time.
Time. Okay? They would say that everything that exists falls into those categories, and there's nothing that isn't physical. Now, the Bible says that the origin of the universe is ex nihilo creation by God. That means from nothing, God spoke the universe into existence. The Bible says that life was directly designed and created by God. And the Bible very clearly indicates that reality is not only physical. The Bible indicates that there is a spiritual component of reality that doesn't fit within physical categories. Now, we'll talk about this more a little bit later, but the fact of the matter is that this is very obviously true. It's obviously true that the world is not only physical. Because you have a mind, you have a heart, you have will, and there's this strange thing that goes on where your spirit or your soul operates your body. And nobody knows how that works. And when your spirit or your soul leaves your body ceases to operate. And there's this very interesting link between your body and your mind, and we don't know exactly how it works, but there is something beyond just the physical. I think if we're honest, we all will admit that. Well, who is fighting? Okay, we've got establishment science, the vast publicly and privately funded system that controls most universities, private laboratories, and government facilities. And on the other side, mostly, we've got Bible-believing Christians, individuals who believe that the Bible is true in all that it actually asserts about spiritual, physical, and historical realities. Now, let me just add, there are some people who are not Bible-believing Christians who nonetheless believe that reality has spiritual components and who don't accept the views of establishment science. Okay, later on I'll tell you about a very interesting book called The Science Delusion. It's written by a man who most definitely is not a Christian, and yet he addresses establishment science and points out that establishment science is ignoring a huge section of reality that has to do with the spiritual world. Okay? Establishment science currently controls almost all research. And their control, particularly in the area of biological research, really has a stifling effect on research. Biological researchers are afraid to say ever the word design. People have been kicked out of universities for saying something like this: the inner ear is designed so that a sound goes from this bone to this bone to this bone. Now they can say it appears to be designed, but if they say it's designed, many of them, they're out the door. Okay, very sad thing. Okay, well, here's an interesting question. Why do we care about these issues? Why are they important? I think they're very important. There's a lot at stake. First of all, money and prestige are at stake, because government funding is the lifeblood of research. Now, back when I was working at Cornell, we were preparing a proposal for the National Science Foundation. We wanted to expand our accelerator facility. Now, at that time, CERN was just being built, and we were considering the possibility that we would build something like CERN. And I was not involved in the writing of that, but I knew what was going on. And it was discussed in our meetings. And what was discussed was not so much the science. What was discussed was how can we come up with a strategy to pitch this thing so that the government will give us hundreds of millions of dollars. Right? Funding is very important in scientific research because scientific research is expensive. Now, if the views of establishment science were overturned, that would lead to a loss of prestige and funding for established institutions. And this is one of the reasons why establishment science won't listen to the evidence for intelligent design. It's too dangerous to them. It attacks their pocketbooks, right? But at a more profound level, the issue really has to do with authority and personal issues, right? Here are the kind of questions that we're talking about. Who is the ultimate authority? What's the purpose of life? Are there any moral absolutes? Now, depending on how you answer the questions of origins, you're going to get different answers to all of these questions. Okay? So let's look at the alternatives regarding authority. Now, if establishment science is right, then, and on the other hand, if the Bible is right, let's look at establishment science first. Okay? If establishment science is right, life is purely an accident. You are nothing but a fluke of the universe. All right? Now, if establishment science is right, man is only the current pinnacle of evolution. That means that something better could come along, and probably will. All right? If establishment science is right, man is his own authority. He's a free agent in the universe. He's not answerable to anyone. If establishment science is right, there really are no moral absolutes. There's no law higher than man. And if man wants to change the rules, he can. And by the way, this has been attempted many times in history. Do you know that the decimal system, the metric system? The metric system was invented by the French in an attempt to overturn the moral foundations of the Western world. Do you know that? Very interesting thing. Okay. If establishment science is right, life has no intrinsic value. Now this always makes me laugh in kind of a sick way. Every once in a while there are people out here in front of the MTR station collecting money for Greenpeace because they're trying to save the whales or they're trying to save some other endangered animal, pandas or whatever. And I love animals. I don't want to see animals go extinct. But the funny thing is, those people are all committed to the evolutionary mindset. Now, if you believe in evolution, why would you try to save an animal that's about to go extinct? The reason it's going extinct is that it can't survive. So let's let it die off and something better come along. That's how we got here. It's so silly. Right? If establishment science is right, then might makes right. This is what Hitler said in World War II. Now, if you know anything about the history of Hitler and the Nazi Party, you know that one of their motivations in doing what they did and trying to cleanse the world of Jews and Slavs and other people. And by the way, I'm Jewish, in case you didn't know. Okay. I have no love for Hitler. They said that we are going to push evolution forward by getting rid of genetically inferior people. And they said, since we are stronger, that gives us the moral right to get rid of those. Okay, now that's a sad thing. That's a sad thing. Now, if the Bible is right, life is God's creation and it's His delight. Right? If you read Genesis chapter 1, you see the creation mandate in which God gives mankind the duty to care for the earth and its creatures. Right? If the Bible is right, man is special because he bears God's image. Very, very special. If the Bible is right, God has authority over man by right of creation. He made us. Therefore, he has the right to tell us how to live. If the Bible is right, there are moral absolutes. They come from God. And because God doesn't change, they won't change. If the Bible is right, life has intrinsic value. That's why, as early as Genesis chapter 4, when the first murder takes place, God calls the murderer on the carpet and said, "What you did is wrong." He doesn't say, "Well, you're more powerful, so go ahead and kill that guy." He says, "It's wrong." In Genesis 9, God commands human society to exercise capital punishment in the case of murder. Right? If the Bible is right, then love, mercy, compassion, justice, and truth matter. They matter to us because they matter to God. Right? So these are some of the reasons why the debate on origins is really very important. Okay? Now, I want to move into our discussion of the biblical foundations of science, and we're going to be talking about the scientific attitude and the scientific method. But before we get to those, we need to talk about worldviews. And for those of you who have studied religion or philosophy, some of this will be a review, no doubt. Now, we're going to be looking at worldviews, their view of the nature of reality, and just a few comments on each one, and then I'll give you some examples. Now, the first worldview roughly includes polytheism, animism, and sort of a magical understanding of the world. People who have this kind of worldview say that the world is real, the physical world is real, but it's controlled by spirits or by gods or by demons. And if you have this kind of worldview, you basically feel that you need to appease or you need to manipulate these spirits to get your life to go well and to have peace so they don't give you trouble. Now, this is part of traditional Chinese thought, isn't it? And it's very common in other parts of the world too. Okay? Now, another view is called pantheism. Pantheism is the idea that everything is divine. There's a physical world, but the physical world isn't really real. The physical world is sort of spiritual, it's divine. Nothing is as it really appears. Pantheists don't believe in a single God. They believe, in a sense, that everything is God. And one attitude that comes from pantheism is the view that realizing good and evil aren't real is the key to peace. If you want peace, you simply have to realize that there is no good and evil. Okay, I'll give you an example of this later. Now, we come to theism. All right, theism is the view of the major Judeo-Christian religions of the world plus Islam. Okay, this is the view that says there's an infinite, personal creator God who made everything that exists, and moral values are determined by him because he owns all things. All right, this is definitely the view of Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and some other religions. Okay? Now then there's naturalism. Naturalism is the idea that man and life are the products of impersonal chance. Everything is physical. Evolution and survival determine morals. We've seen this already. And then there's an interesting view called postmodernism. Now, if you go online and you look up a definition of postmodernism, virtually everywhere you go will say it's difficult to define postmodernism. Postmodernism is an attitude that's very common in the world today, but it's easier to define by what it isn't than by what it is. Right? Postmodernists don't like the idea of absolute truth. Postmodernists don't like authority. Now, in my family, I have one brother who's saved, and all the rest of my family are unsaved. And I have tried to share the gospel with my older sister and my younger sister, and when they don't get angry, they will say something like this: "I'm glad that that makes you happy." And I will say, no, 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 no. This isn't about what makes me happy. And I'll say, honestly, there are some things about what the Bible teaches that don't make me happy. but I have to accept them because they're true. They're absolutely true. And my sister will say, well, I don't believe in absolute truth. And then I will say to her, well, are you absolutely sure there's no such thing as absolute truth? And that's when they get really mad and the conversation ends. See, postmodernists believe that tolerance is the highest virtue. As long as you don't insist that you're right, they'll say you can believe anything that you want. So it's very hard to define postmodernists, but they hold toleration, inclusiveness, and denial of absolutes as supreme values. Okay? Now let's look at some examples of this. Polytheism, animism, magical worldview. Well, this to some extent includes Hinduism, it includes tribal religions, it includes medieval alchemy. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Ancestor worship. Pantheism, many scientists are pantheists. You might be surprised that there are a lot of physicists, particularly particle physicists, who study the nature of matter at the lowest level, who are pantheists. They've adopted many Hindu ideas. Wicca, I don't know if you know what Wicca is, but Wicca is kind of a form of witchcraft. It's a religion that involves witchcraft, supposedly white witchcraft. And then there's something called Christian Science. Now, there was a time when I was working in science when I could have called myself a Christian Scientist, but I was not a member of Christian Science. Okay? If you don't know what Christian Science is, let me just warn you, Christian Science is not Christian and it's not science. Right? It's very badly labeled. Okay, now theism, we've said it includes Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Naturalism. Most established scientists are naturalists, and a large number of people on the street are naturalists. Now, naturalism is the same thing as scientific materialism. We'll talk about scientific materialism later. But naturalism is basically the view that everything is physical, there is no God, there is no spiritual reality. Okay? And postmodernism, well, this is very common among millennials. It's very common among all kinds of people. And a lot of scientists are postmodernists. And the funny thing is, naturalism and postmodernism are not really compatible. Many postmodernists are open to spiritual realities. They just don't like it when you say, well, my understanding of spiritual reality is the right one and yours is wrong. But at the same time, they're naturalists. It's a very odd thing. Now, the reason I point this out, and by the way, one of the reasons I'm teaching this course is that among Christians, there is a lot of what we would call cognitive dissonance. Okay, for you psychology majors, you know what cognitive dissonance is. Cognitive dissonance is when you hold ideas in your head and you're committed to them, but they actually contradict each other. Now, a lot of Christians are stuck in that position. They are absolutely committed to the truth and the authority of the Bible, but they believe scientists when scientists say life came into existence by evolution. And so they don't really know what to do with this area, so they just stay away from it. One of my goals in this course is to help you to come to a point where you can say, well, I'm either here or I'm here. Now, I hope you will side with the view that says that God created life and that you'll reject Darwinism. But even if you say, I go with Darwin, I hope you'll realize that you can't say, I go with Darwin and I go with the Bible, and do so in an intellectually consistent way. All right? Okay. Well, let's talk about the history of the Western world. Right? And you say, why are we going to talk about the history of the Western world? Because understanding this history will help us to see the biblical foundations of modern science. Okay, I'm going to take you through a quick sweep of the history of the Western world. Now, you may be wondering why I'm talking about the Western world. I'm not ignoring the rest of the world. I'm not ignoring Asia. But I'm focusing on the part of the world that brought in the most rapid flowering of science. And the Asian world has caught up very fast, and it's interesting. China and Japan are surpassing the Western world in a lot of scientific research and things now. Okay? From around 60 BC to AD 320, the Roman Empire was flourishing. It was around 320 to 400 that the Roman Empire first tolerated Christianity, made it not illegal, and then eventually adopted Christianity as its official religion. Now, around 470, the Western Roman Empire fell, and Western Europe entered into what is often called the Dark Ages. Now, the Dark Ages were a time when the Roman Catholic Church became monastic, they became highly authoritarian, they discouraged people from knowing the Bible. They just said, you listen to what we tell you. They adopted an ascetic, A-S-C-E-T-I-C, approach to spirituality, which is the idea that if you make yourself suffer, if you don't enjoy good food, if you don't enjoy the blessings of life, you'll become more spiritual. They discouraged independent thought, and superstition and magical thinking became very widespread. In the Middle Ages, there were a lot of people who were involved in magic, they were involved in alchemy. Alchemy was, among other things, an attempt to use magic to turn lead into gold and to do those kinds of things. Witchcraft, divination, sorcery were common, as well as alchemy. And there was very little progress in architecture, technology, or what we would call science during that period of time. Now, around 1450, leading up to 1600, we have two things going on that were basically simultaneous: the Reformation and the Renaissance. Now, most of you know what the Reformation was. The Reformation was an event in which some theologians within the Roman Catholic Church said, we are misreading the Bible. We are preaching a gospel that doesn't match God's word. And the early reformers were not trying to tear down the Roman Catholic Church. They were not trying to destroy the Roman Catholic Church. They were trying to reform the Roman Catholic Church. But as it turned out, it didn't succeed. They had to leave it, and they began what we call the Protestant Reformation. Now, at the same time, there was something going on which we call the Renaissance, and Renaissance is rebirth. Okay? It's basically the same idea that Jesus used when he said, you must be born again. But this was the rebirth of intelligent thought, rational thought, those kinds of things. Okay? Now, in the Reformation and Renaissance, confidence in an orderly universe arose from the biblical account of the creation of the universe by one God. As people began to take the Bible seriously, they said, well, if the entire universe was created by one God, that means the world is not controlled by the spirit who lives behind the rock and the spirit who's on the top of that mountain. The world is designed by a single God who made it in an orderly fashion and established natural laws which will work the same everywhere. Therefore, there are universal natural laws. Now, you see the word universe in there? This is quite interesting. How do we know that stars that are millions of light years away are made of the same elements that we have here on the Earth? We know because we can analyze the light that comes from them through spectroscopes, and we see the same evidence of atomic and nuclear structure that we see when we look at elements here on the Earth. And so there's evidence that way out there, way farther than anybody has ever gone, the same natural laws apply. Now, this idea first came into existence through the study of Scripture. Now, once you have the idea that there are universal natural laws, This provides confidence that controlled, repeatable experiments will have predictable outcomes. If you do the same experiment over and over and you control the variables, you should get the same result every time. This is very important in the whole scientific method. Now, as this happened, magical and alchemical thinking declined. All this stuff started to go away. Independent thought and inquiry began to flourish, both in the areas of theology and science. Now, as this was going on, in the West, movable type came into existence, so the printing of books became possible, and the Bible became widely available, other books became widely available, and people began sharing information. And you know that when people share information, things can happen very fast. By the way, that's why God scrambled the languages at the Tower of Babel. Okay? The sharing of information and ideas definitely promoted science. Now, one other thing that I won't say a lot about, but it's very important to recognize, was that there was a lot of ancient science and mathematics and literature which were lost to the Western world during the Dark Ages, which were later rediscovered and shared with the Western world from the Arabic world and from Asia. And that also contributed to the growth of science at this time. Now, from the Renaissance to today, we go through a few more periods. From around 1600 to 1780 was what has been called the Enlightenment. Now, this is a very interesting phrase. This is where people are starting to say, we are enlightened people. Now, I hope you detect a note of pride in that statement. In the Enlightenment, the successes of the Renaissance in science and technology are beginning to make people proud. People are beginning to shift away from the theistic basis that made the Renaissance and the Reformation take place, moving in the direction of humanism. They're starting to say, well, if we can figure out all these things, we don't really need God. Now, that doesn't totally happen during the Enlightenment, but it's beginning to happen. Okay? People are beginning to doubt the spiritual world, and they're beginning to doubt the Bible, which enabled them to get here in the first place. Now then we come into the modern era, which runs roughly from 1780 to 1990. Now these are very approximate dates. These eras overlap. Okay? But the reason I picked the late 1780s was it's in the late 1700s that steam engines are developed. Now the development of the steam engine allowed people to build factories almost anywhere. It used to be that factories had to be located near places where there were rivers that had falls that you could use to power water wheels and get energy to run machines. The steam engine changed all that. Now after the steam engine, we get the internal combustion engine, we get the discovery of electricity and magnetism and radio waves. People invent machines for recording sound. I mean, all this stuff just, it mushrooms. It happens so fast, and we're still living in the middle of that, aren't we? So this has never really ended. Now it's in the middle 1800s that Darwin comes along with his theory, and we'll talk about that later. We will see that whether or not it was Darwin's intent, the arisal of Darwin's theory did cause Christianity to decline, right? It weakened people's confidence in the existence of God. And scientific materialism, this is the same as naturalism. This is the idea that there is only physical reality. There's nothing else. Scientific materialism becomes the dominant worldview. Now, I grew up in the 50s and 60s, and I was very much a scientific materialist, right? And many of you were too. We just believed that the whole world was physical, right? We believed that science was going to figure everything out. Now, interestingly, when scientific materialism comes in, secular humanism also comes in. Now, the word secular just means worldly. But the idea here is that In secular humanism, people are saying man is the pinnacle. We don't need God. We will design society the way we want to make it. We have confidence that we can make a better world. And there's really nothing blocking us except our willingness to work together. Okay, this is a very optimistic worldview, and it fails because it fails to take notice of another reality, which is human sin. But this is very much the worldview of most of the world today. Now, from around 1990 to today, and again, this isn't a hard number, we come into postmodernism, and we've already talked about what that is. Okay? And as I said earlier, many people today are both modernists and postmodernists, despite the incompatibilities of these worldviews. It's a very strange thing, but it's true. Okay? Now the next slide that I'm going to put up, I'm only going to put up for a few seconds. There's nothing secret about it. I'm just giving you a list of Bible-believing Christians who made enormous contributions to science as we know it today. And you'll see some names on there that are very familiar to you, and maybe a few that aren't. But all of these people were people who had a biblical worldview. These are people who believed in the God of the Bible. Believing in the God of the Bible didn't make them bad scientists. In fact, it made them better scientists, because it made them seek in a way to understand God's thoughts after Him. For example, where is he? Michael Faraday. Michael Faraday is basically the guy who discovered many of the laws behind the propagation of radio waves. Now, radio waves are pretty mysterious things. But he didn't give up and say, oh, I just don't understand it, or it must be operated by spirits. He said, there have to be rules that determine how this thing works, because I believe God made an orderly universe. And that led him to keep studying until he came to the point where he could understand those principles. Okay? So I want you to be aware that being a Christian doesn't mean that one has to be a bad scientist. Just the opposite is true, in my opinion. Okay, now we've got about 10 minutes before our break. I'll give you your break at approximately 8:30. I want to begin to talk about the scientific method. Okay? The scientific method. All right, the scientific method is at the heart of experimental science. As it's practiced today, it's based on the following assumptions. Now, I'm going to go through this slowly because this is very important that we all understand. Okay? Now, the first assumption is this. The universe that we live in is an orderly universe that goes all the way back to the biblical foundations of science. That means that we should expect things to work the same way every time. Now, secondly, natural law operates uniformly in all of the universe. It's quite fascinating. Scientists are sending probes into outer space. They're going out to Jupiter, out to Saturn, farther out than that. And when they send those probes out, they do calculations in advance of the trajectories of those probes through space. They are making assumptions regarding how the gravity of various planets are going to affect the motion of those probes. And they are assuming that gravity works the same way out there as it does here. And guess what? It does. It does. That's really quite fascinating. The universe is orderly, and natural law does work the same in all the universe. Now, the third point looks silly, but it's not silly. All effects have causes. Things don't just happen. without causes. Okay? Things don't just happen. Now, we'll probably mention this later, but there was a theory called biogenesis, which was held by many people. And this theory said that if you have decaying organic matter, like garbage, life will spontaneously appear. Now, we've all seen the kind of thing that leads people to believe that. If you leave garbage in your garbage can, and you don't do anything about it, you don't cover it, pretty soon you're going to see flies and maggots there, right? And the idea was that decaying organic matter produces life, right? That was the view. Now, they didn't really have any cause for the appearance of that life. Now, it wasn't until scientists took a closer look at what was going on there until they realized there was a cause for the appearance of those maggots. What was really happening was that eggs of flies that had either been laid earlier or were laid when nobody was looking were hatching. And that was the cause of the appearance of life. Okay? But it's very important that we understand that all effects have causes. Right? Nothing just happens. Everything that happens is caused by something else happening. By the way, that's going to lead to some very interesting philosophical questions. If everything that happens now is caused by something that happened a few moments earlier, well, what happens if we go back, and we go back, and we go back? How far back can you go? Do you go forever? Or is there a cause that started the whole thing in motion? This is a very important question. We'll talk about that when we talk about the origin of the universe. Okay? Now, here's another important concept. All physical processes are influenced only by physical causes. All right? This is an assumption that comes from scientific materialism. Because scientific materialists say that the only realities that exist are physical. Okay? So, for example, let's say that you're running an experiment and somebody says, I'm going to sit on the other side of the wall, away from your experiment, and I'm going to sit here and I'm going to exercise the power of my mind to make the experiment come out differently this time. Now, most scientists will just laugh. Most scientists will just laugh. Because they will say, that can't happen. Your mind is not a physical cause. It cannot influence a physical process. Okay? Now, people who study things like ESP, people who study things like telekinesis, you know, the idea that you can move objects with the power of your mind, or things like telepathy, won't accept this viewpoint. But the majority of establishment scientists do accept this viewpoint. Okay? Now, with these assumptions in mind, here are the steps of the scientific method. First, you pick a system and you observe that physical system. You watch how it works. You take data on it. You observe it over and over. You do everything you can to isolate variables and make sure nothing is affecting it that you're not aware of. Now, once you've observed it for a long time, you then form a hypothesis to explain what you have observed. Now, I'll tell you kind of a silly joke. There was a man who was studying the hearing of frogs. So he put a frog on the table, and he said, "Jump, frog, jump!" And so the frog jumped. Then he cut off the front leg. And he said, "Jump, frog, jump!" And the frog jumped. Then he cut off the other front leg. "Jump, frog, jump!" And the frog jumped. He cuts off the back leg. "Jump, frog, jump!" So the frog jumps. Then he cuts off the last leg and says, "Jump, frog, jump!" And the frog doesn't jump. So he writes down in his book, "Frog with no legs cannot hear." Now, that's not very good scientific method. But, you see, he's looking, he's putting together a hypothesis, right? Based on his observations. Now, it turns out his hypothesis isn't good, all right? But the scientific method provides a means of testing hypotheses, all right? Once you have formed a hypothesis, the next step in the scientific method is to make a prediction based on the hypothesis. Okay? Let's suppose you are Michael Faraday and you are studying the propagation of radio waves. And you have a theory that radio waves travel at the speed of light. Right? You make a number of experiments and that seems to be the case. Well, then you make a prediction and you say, well, if I create a radio wave here and I set up a receiver on the other side of the ocean, it should take this long to get there. And then you perform the experiment to test the prediction. All right? The last step is that you, the next step is that you do repeated experiments to test the prediction. And by the way, sometimes the prediction is right and sometimes it's not. If your prediction isn't right, what do? You say, well, the prediction isn't right. Either I did the experiment wrong or my hypothesis is wrong. If you come to the conclusion that you did the experiment wrong, you try to do it correctly. If you do everything you can and your prediction still doesn't work, what do? You go back and you say, I need a new hypothesis. Okay? This is the basic scientific method. And it's an iterative process. You do it over and over. The more times you do it, the closer you come to understanding the truth. Okay, now let's talk about Galileo. Okay, Galileo, among other things, was one of the first scientists to show that all objects fall at the same rate under gravity. Now, when Galileo said that, people laughed at him because they said, "Oh, come on, we know that's not true. If you drop a brick, it falls fast. If you drop a feather, it falls slowly." Right? Well, Galileo said, okay, that may be true, but let's suppose we take a large brick and a small brick and we drop them. And what did he show? That they fall at the same rate. Now, what he really was showing, and people came to realize this, was that with very light, feathery objects, there is resistance in the air that's enough to make a visible difference in how rapidly they fall. But with fairly heavy objects, the resistance of the air is so small that its effect on the speed of falling is not measurable. Have any of you ever been to a science museum where they have one of those evacuated tubes, there's no air in it, and they drop the feathers and they go boom, right? They fall just as fast as a brick. Okay, so he was applying the scientific method. Now, the scientific method is a very powerful and very good tool. And we are all beneficiaries of the scientific method. And as we go through this course, I don't want to make you hate science. Right? That's not my goal. Good science is wonderful stuff. Right? We all benefit from it. But the scientific method has its limitations, and we will talk about them after our break. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed or benefited from this study of science in the Bible, I hope you'll recommend it to others. See you in the next part of the series.